Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism by Gershom G. Scholem. Merkabah Mysticism and Jewish Gnosticism continued. Locke was the first to point out that the community prayer, in its final form, which it received in the late Talmudic and post-Talmudic times, represents a compromise between these two opposing tendencies. Some of these prayers are indeed much older than was thought by Locke, who has overlooked certain passages of the Palestinian Talmud and attributed every prayer which mentions the angels of the Merkabah to the post-Talmudic period. But since the mystical school of Yorda Merkabah is, in general, of much earlier origin than Zunz, Gratz, and Bloch assumed, and may have been in existence in Palestine during the 4th century, this fact presents no difficulty for our connection. While the Merkabah hymns with which we are dealing hardly go back beyond the 5th century of the Common Era, they continue a tradition already visible in the throne mysticism and the apocalyptic of the Mishnaic period. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, whose connection with the Merkabah mysticism has also struck its English editor, G.H. Box, the patriarch who ascends to the throne hears a voice speaking from the celestial fire like a voice of many waters, like the sound of the sea in its uproar. The same terms are used in the greater Hekaloth in describing the sound of the hymn of praise sung by the throne of glory to its king, like the voice of the waters in the rushing streams, like the waves of the ocean when the south wind sets them in uproar. The same apocalypse contains the song which Abraham is taught by the angel who guides him on his way to heaven. And this song is nothing but the hymn sung by the angels who mount guard before the throne. Although the attributes of God are in some cases identical with those used in Greek and early Christian prayers, this hymn already has the numinous character described above. God is praised as the holy being and also as the supreme master. This is quite in harmony with the characteristic outlook of these hymns, whether sung by the angels or by Israel, in which the veneration of God the King blends imperceptibly with the conjuring magic of the adept. The presentation of the crown to God is almost the only act through which the devotee can still bear witness to the religious destiny of man. It is characteristic of these hymns that the traditional vocabulary of the Hebrew language, although by no means restricted in this field, no longer sufficed for the spiritual needs of the ecstatic eager to express his vision of God's majesty in words. This is evident from the large number of original and frequently bizarre phrases and word combinations, sometimes entirely novel creations, all bearing a decidedly numinous character, and which perhaps mark the beginning of the flood of new verbal creations to be found in the oldest classics of Palestinian synagogal poetry since the 7th century of the Common Era. Thus, for example, the influence of the Merkabah literature on Eliezer Kalir, the outstanding master of this school, is obvious enough. The extent to which in these circles the hymn was regarded as the original language of the creature addressing itself to its creator, the extent, therefore, to which they had adopted the prophetic vision of a redeemed world in which all beings speak in hymns, is clear from a brief tract called Perek Shirah, i.e. the chapter of the Song of Creation. Here all beings are gifted with the language for the soul because they may sing in biblical words the praise of their Creator. Originally known only among mystics, this poem gradually made its way against violent opposition whose motives are not clear into the liturgy of the daily prayers. To sum up, it would appear that the Merkabah mystics were led by logical steps in the direction of mystical prayer, without, however, having developed anything like a mystical theory of prayer. One is perhaps justified in seeing a first step towards such a theory in the characteristic exaggeration of the significance of Israel's prayer in the celestial realm. Only when Israel has sung may the angels join in. One of them, Shemuel, the great archon, stands at the window of heaven as a mediator between the prayers of Israel which rise from below and the denizens of the seventh heaven, to whom he transfers them. The angel who bears the name of Israel stands in the center of heaven and leads the heavenly choir with the call, God is king, God was king, God will ever be king. Great, though the importance of prayer undoubtedly is for him, the Merkabah mystic who pours out his heart in ecstatic and spontaneous hymns seeks no mysteries behind the words of prayer. The assent of the words has not yet substituted itself for the assent of the soul and of the devotee himself. The pure word, the as yet unbroken summons, stands for itself. It signifies nothing but what it expresses. But it is not surprising that when the fire out of which these prayers had streamed to heaven had burned low, a host of nostalgic sounds stirred the ashes, looking in vain for the spirit which had departed. 6. We have seen that the God of the Merkabah mystics is the holy king who emerges from unknown worlds and descends through 955 heavens to the throne of glory. The mystery of this God in his aspect of creator of the universe is one of those exalted subjects of esoteric knowledge which are revealed to the soul of the mystic in its ecstatic ascent. It is of equal importance with the vision of the celestial realm, the songs of the angels, and the structure of the Merkabah, according to an account given in the Greater Hekaloth, which one is tempted to correlate with a similar passage at the end of the fourth book of Ezra. It was even the custom to place scribes or stenographers to the right and left of the visionary who wrote down his ecstatic description of the throne and its occupants. That the mystic in his rapture even succeeded in penetrating beyond the sphere of the angels is suggested in a passage which speaks of God who is beyond the sight of his creatures and hidden to the angels who serve him, but who has revealed himself to Rabbi Akiba in the vision of the Merkabah. It is this new revelation, at once strange and forbidding, which we encounter in the most paradoxical of all these tracts, the one which is known under the name of Shi'ur Koma, literally translated measure of the body, i.e. the body of God. Okay, Kama. There's another meaning for that in Aramea. Trying to think of that, but sometimes it's hard from you got sheer. Is there? I'm not. I know two of the letters for certain, Sheen and Rash. But anyways, literally translated measure of the body from the very beginning. The frank and almost provocative anthropomorphism of the Shi'ur Koma aroused the bitterest antagonism among all Jewish circles, which held aloof from mysticism. Conversely, all the latter mystics and Kabbalists came to regard its dark and obscure language as a symbol of profound and penetrating spiritual vision. The antagonism was mutual, for it is in this attitude toward anthropomorphism that Jewish rational theology and Jewish mysticism have parted company. The fragment in question, of which several different texts are extant, describes the body of the Creator in close analogy to the description of the body of the Beloved One in the 5th chapter of the Song of Solomon, giving enormous figures for the length of each organ. At the same time, it indicates the secret names of the various organs with the help of letters and configurations to which to us are meaningless. Whoever knows the measurements of our Creator and the glory of the Holy One, praise be to him, which are hidden from the creatures, is certain of his share of the world to come. Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiba, the two heroes of Merkabah mysticism, appear as the guarantors of this sweeping promise, provided that this Mishnah is daily repeated. What is really meant by these monstrous length measurements is not made clear. The enormous figures have no intelligible meaning, are sense content, and it is impossible really to visualize the body of the Shekinah, which they purport to describe, and they are better calculated, on the contrary, to reduce every attempt at such vision to obscurity. No, because that's, Shekinah means the presence. But it's also used as a term to refer to the Holy Ghost, Gabriel, the angels in general, or any specific angel that's perhaps not even known in its character or name or whatever, but the units of measuring are cosmic. The height of the Creator is 236,000 parsangs. According to another tradition, the height of its souls alone is 30 million parsangs, but the measure of a parsang of God is 3 miles, and a mile has 10,000 yards, and a yard 3 spans of his span, and a span fills the whole world, as it is written, who hath meted out heaven with the span. Now, the ancient Persians and the ancient Hindus and some of the ancient African cultures, well, I guess it might be technically more common to say Iranian, the Indo-Iranian culture, some of these cultures had a much bigger idea of God than the Judeo-Christian idea. Of course, the Judeo idea sounds bigger than the Christian one, but plainly, therefore, it is not really intended to indicate by these numbers any concrete length measurements, whether the proportion of the various figures now hopelessly confused in the texts once expressed some intrinsic relationships with harmonies is a question to which we are not likely to find an answer. Now, if you look at some of the numbers that show up in some of what we call Hindu texts, by Hindu, I, of course, refer to the race, because Hinduism there's not really a Hinduism as far as a religion. The British came up with that term. But some of those terms indicate some things about the age of the earth and other things. It turns out to be pretty accurate concerning modern science. And they actually reference it to things that can be referred to that. But a feeling for the transmundane and the numinous still glimmers through these blasphemous-sounding figures and monstrous groupings of secret names. God's holy majesty takes on flesh and blood, as it were, in these enormous numerical relationships. At any rate, the idea that God is king lends itself more easily to such symbolical expression than the conception of God as spirit. Again we see that it was the exaltation of his kingship and his theophany which appealed to these mystics, not his spirituality. It is true that occasionally we find a paradoxical change into the spiritual. All of a sudden, in the midst of the Shi'ur coma, we read a passage like the following: the appearance of the face is like that of the cheekbones, and both are like the figure of the spirit and the form of the soul, and no creature may recognize it. His body is like chrysolite. His light breaks tremendously from the darkness. Clouds and fog are around him, and all the princes of the angels and the seraphim are before him like an empty jar. Therefore, no measure is given to us, but only secret names are revealed to us in the writings of the 2nd and 3rd century Gnostics, and in certain Greek and Coptic texts which frequently reflect a mystical spiritualism. We find a similar species of mystical anthropomorphism, which, with references to the body of the Father, are the body of truth. Gaster has pointed out the significance of such instances of anthropomorphism in the writings of the 2nd century Gnostic Marcos, described by some scholars as Kabbalistic, which are hardly less bizarre and obscure than the analogous examples in the Shi'ur coma. Now, the 2nd century was when the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had, Matthew, Mark, and Luke had their first versions. But this is not the same Marcos. The fact, probably, is that this form of speculation originated among heretical mystics who had all but broken with rabbinical Judaism. At some date, this school or group must have blended with the rabbinical Gnosticism. developed by the Merkabah visionaries, i.e., that form of Jewish Gnosticism which tried to remain true to the halakhic tradition. Here we come inevitably to the question whose bodily dimensions are the subject of these fantastic descriptions. The prophet Ezekiel saw on the throne of the Merkabah a figure similar to that of a man. Ezekiel 1:26. Just y'all. Does it not seem possible that among the mystics who wrote the She'er Koma, this figure was identified with the primordial man of contemporary Iranian specification, which thus made its entry into the world of Jewish mysticism? Going a step further, we may ask whether there did not exist at any rate among the Merkabah mystics, to whom we owe the preservation of the She'er Koma, a belief in a fundamental distinction between the appearance of God the Creator, the demiurge, i.e. one of his aspects, well, because God's not just the maker, the former, but a lot of people like to break up the qualities of God and put them into different entities, or act like they can anyways. One of his aspects, and his indefinable essence. There is no denying the fact that it is precisely the primordial man on the throne of the Merkabah whom the She'er Koma calls Yotzer Bereshith, i.e. creator of the world, a significant and doubtless deliberate designation. As it is well known, the anti-Jewish Gnostics of the 2nd and 3rd centuries drew a sharp distinction between the unknown, strange, good God and the Creator whom they identify with the God of Israel. It may be that the She'er Koma reflects an attempt to give a new turn to this trend of thought which had become widespread throughout the Near East by postulating something like a harmony between the Creator and the true God. A dualism of the Gnostic kind would, of course, have been unthinkable for Jews. Instead, the demiurge becomes, by an exercise of mystical anthropomorphism, the appearance of God on the throne of glory, at once visible and yet by virtue of his transcendent nature incapable of being really visualized. If this interpretation is correct, we should be justified in saying that the She'er Koma referred not to the dimensions of the divinity, but to those of its corporeal appearance. This is clearly the interpretation of the original texts. Already the lesser Hekaloth interpret the anthropomorphism, the anthropomorphosis of the She'er Koma as a representation of the hidden glory. Thus, for example, Rabbi Akiba says, "He is like us, as it were, but greater than everything, and that is his glory which is hidden from us." The conception of God's hidden glory, which forms the subject of much theosophical speculation, is almost identical, as we have seen, with the term employed for the object of their deepest veneration by the actual representatives of the Mishnaic Merkabah mysticism, among them the historical Rabbi Akiba. One has only to compare it with the relevant passage of the She'er Koma already quoted above, where it says, "Whoever knows the measurements of our Creator and the glory of the Holy One, praise be to him," etc. The term employed, Shivho Shel Hakadosh Baruch, signifies not only praise of God in this context that would be without any meaning, but glory, doxa, sheva, being the equivalent of the Aramea word for glory, shubha. The reference, in short, is not to God's praise, but to the vision of his glory. Later, when the glory of God had become identified with the Shekinah, the alphabet of Rabbi Akiba expressly referred to the body of the Shekinah as the subject of the She'er Koma. The employment of this term is proof that its authors had in mind not the substance of divinity, but merely the measurements of its appearance. She'er Koma speculation is already to be found in the earliest Hekaloth texts and must be counted among the older possessions of Jewish Gnosticism. Gratz' theory that it came into being at a late date under the influence of Muslim anthropomorphic tendencies is entirely fallacious and has confused matters down to our own day. And of course, Islam has completely undone anthropomorphism. So, in both those respects, it's overturned. God's not like anything and anything. God's not a male, or not born, not died. None of that stuff. Without need. If there can be any question of external influence, it was certainly the other way around. This is also borne out by the assertion of the Arabic Arab doxograph Shahrastani. Not, it is true, an altogether reliable witness that these ideas made their way from Jewish into Muslim circles. Still less, it is possible to agree with Bloch's hypothesis that the Shi'ur Coma, with its exaggerations and its dull dryness, was intended for school children. Now we can see also that certain patterns and stuff made its way the other way around. But furthermore, we can see that Islam does not claim to be supportive of any founder of a religion. So it's not saying that no prophet ever passed this stuff on, that no mystic on the side ever had any experience that confirmed these things. So, but things start with school children, right? It's not, it's not that these lessons can't be repeated to adults. The curious tendency of some 19th century Jewish scholars to treat profoundly mythical and mystical references to God and the world as pedagogical obiter dicta for the benefit of small children is certainly one of the most remarkable examples of misplaced criticism and insensitiveness to the character of religious phenomena which this period has produced. Now, before I get into 7, people act like, morality, guilt and shame and fear, rather than being useful things your whole life and perhaps a bit more controlled and a bit more useful as you get older, you just try to put them aside and, you're just not mature. It's like breaking down your sense of feeling bad for doing bad things isn't quite the same thing as maturity. You can be just as mature and have, an even greater awareness of these things and an even greater concern for these things. Or, what I'm trying to articulate. The Shi'ur Coma is not the only subject of mystical vision in this group. There are several others, some of which undoubtedly originated from entirely different sources, but were more or less closely mixed up with the Shi'ur Coma during the period when all these various tendencies crystallized in the classical Hakeloth literature. To the later mystics, they presented what appeared to be, on the whole, a uniform picture. The most important of these deviations from the main current is the Metatron mysticism, which revolves around the person of Enoch, who, after a lifetime of piety, was raised, according to the legend, to the rank of the first of the angels and Sarhapanim, literally Prince of the Divine Face, or Divine Presence. God took me from the midst of the race of the flood and carried me on the stormy wings of the Shekinah to the highest heaven and brought me into the great palaces on the heights of the seventh heaven, Araboth, where there are the throne of the Shekinah and the Merkabah, the legions of anger and hosts of wrath, the Shananim of the fire, the cherubim of the flaming torches, Ophanim of the fiery coals, the servants of the flames, and the seraphim of the lightning. And he stood me there daily to serve the throne of glory, this Enoch, whose flesh was turned to flame, his veins to fire, his eyelashes to flashes of lightning, his eyeballs to flaming torches, and whom God placed on a throne next to the throne of glory, received after this heavenly transformation the name Metatron. The visions of the heavenly traveler Enoch, as set out in the Ethiopic and Slavonic books of Enoch, have become in the Enoch book of the Merkabah mystics accounts given to Rabbi Ishmael by Metatron of his metamorphosis and of his and of the hierarchy of the throne and the angels, it is impossible to overlook the steady line of developments in this Enoch mysticism. Moreover, the Hebrew book of Enoch is not the only link between the earlier Enoch legend and the later Jewish mysticism. Some of the oldest mythical motifs are to be found not in that book, but in an extremely interesting, from the mythographical point of view, magical text, the Havdalah of Rabbi Akiba, of which several are as yet unpublished manuscripts, but they are in existence. In the Greater Hekaloth, on the other hand, we find Metatron mentioned only once in a chapter belonging to the later stratum. The earlier chapters do not mention him at all. It was after the beginning of the 2nd century, the Common Era, probably not earlier, that the patriarch Enoch was identified following his metamorphosis with the angel Yehoel or Yoel, who occupies an important and sometimes dominant position in the earliest documents of the throne mysticism and in the apocalypses, which that's not quite the same as saying an end time document, although some of them talk about that. The most important characteristics of this angel are now transferred to Metatron. We also find Yehoel as the first in the various lists of the 70 names of Metatron compiled in the Gaonic period, 7th to 11th centuries. The Babylonian Talmud contains only 3 references to Metatron, and the most important of these passages is meaningless if thought to refer to the names of Metatron. It refers to a tradition from the beginning of the 4th century, according to which Metatron is the angel of whom it is said in Exodus 23:20, and so on. Beware of him, for my name is in him. The explanation is to be found in the 10th chapter of the Apocalypse of Abraham, already mentioned several times, where the angel Yehoel says to Abraham, I am called Yehoel, and some other stuff is said, a power and virtue of the ineffable name that is dwelling in me. That the name Yehoel contains the name of God is obvious, Yeho being an abbreviation of the Tetragrammaton Yahweh, which was used especially often in texts bearing on Jewish Hellenistic syncretism. The same Yehoel is referred to in Jewish Gnostical literature as the Lesser Yahoo, a term which, at the end of the 2nd century, had already made its way into non-Jewish Gnostical literature, but which was also retained by the Merkabah mystics as the most exalted cognomen of Metatron, one which to outsiders seemed to border on blasphemy. Also, in the Talmudic passage cited above, the assumption that the verse in Exodus 24:1, ascend to Yahweh, refers to Metatron, seems to contain an implicit recognition of the latter as the lesser Yahweh, which he becomes explicitly in latter texts. Mention may be made, moreover, of a further and very striking example of the extreme stubbornness with which ancient traditions are preserved in Jewish mystical literature, often in out-of-the-way places. In the Apocalypse of Abraham, Yehoel appears as the spiritual teacher of the patriarch, to whom he explains the mysteries of the throne world and the Last Judgment, exactly as Metatron does in the Hekaloth tracts. Abraham is here the prototype of the novice who is initiated into the mystery, just as he appears at the end of the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, a document, the precise age of which is not known, but the character of which I propose to discuss at the end of this lecture. In the Apocalypse, we find him being initiated into the mysteries of the Merkabah, just as in the Sefer Yetzirah, he is allowed to penetrate into the mysteries of its cosmogonical speculation. It is somewhat surprising to read in a manuscript originating among the 12th century Jewish mystics in Germany that Yehoel was Abraham's teacher and taught him the whole of the Torah. The same document also expressly mentions Yehoel as the angel who, in the above-mentioned Talmudic passages, invites Moses to ascend to heaven. Thus, the tradition attached to his name must still have been preserved in the medieval literature. If the meaning of the name Yehoel is fairly clear, that to Metatron is completely obscure. There have been very many attempts to throw light on the etymology of the word. the most widely accepted interpretation being that according to which Metatron is short for Metathronios, i.e. he who stands beside God's throne, or who occupies the throne next to the divine throne. Mention of his throne is indeed made in the later Hebrew book of Enoch. What was the Hebrew book of Enoch? I knew there was an Aramea book of Enoch, but there is not the slightest suggestion that the author saw any connection between the name of the Archon and his throne. The fact is that all these etymologies are so much guesswork, and they're studied rationally leads nowhere. Now, if you look at the Semitic spellings, you're going to run into something that's more than that. But then there's corrupted spellings and stuff like that, too, that occur in the case. So, yeah. There's no such word as metathronios in Greek, and it is extremely unlikely that Jews should have produced or invented such Greek phrase. In Talmudic literature, the word thronos is never used in the place of its Hebrew equivalent. On the other hand, the reduplication of the T and the ending ron follow a pattern which runs throughout all these texts. Both ending and the repetition of the consonant are observable. For instance, in names like Zohar Ariel and Adir Iran, it must also be borne in mind that on and ron may have been fixed and typical constituents of such names rather than meaningful syllables. It is quite possible that the word Metatron was chosen on strictly symbolical grounds, and represents one of the innumerable secret names which abound in the Hekloth text no less than in Gnostical writings or in the magical papyri. Now, sometimes through this you get meanings that are unintended. It's meant to be a magical formula based on other things than the semantics of the word. So, Originally formed, apparently, in order to replace the name Yahoel as a vox mystica, it gradually usurped its place. It is interesting, by the way, that the spelling in the oldest quotations and manuscripts is Mithrun. So Meme, Yud, Theth, Rash, Wow, Noon, a fact which is usually overlooked. This would seem to suggest that the word was pronounced Thathruung rather than Metatron, as a transcription of the Greek epsilon. In the word meta, the yod in the name would appear to be quite superfluous.